I'm going to attempt to create this walkthrough tutorial style animation, and this is something you see on a lot of sites and is really common, and this is also the very first time I'm attempting to solve this problem. So you can see my thought process, how I go about planning this problem, and what I do when I run into different issues. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name is Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And in this video, we're going to cover this Intro.js library. It's a pretty involved library, but the main thing it does is you click Live Demo, and there's essentially a multiple different things you can do for like a step-by-step process. You can click to go to the next step, and it's going to highlight all these different elements on the page, scrolling you around, and it's a really cool style of animation and tutorial that you're going to see on a lot of different projects. So this is something I want to try to tackle myself because I think it has a lot of cool, interesting concepts to it. I don't think it's going to be too difficult, but it'll present a lot of really cool problems. So to get started on the left, I actually have some boilerplate HTML set up just so we have something to work with that we can like highlight different elements on. This HTML has nothing to do with the library. It's just something to use as a boilerplate. And if you actually want to see the tutorial for building out this card-based grid, I'll leave a link for it in the cards and description down below for you. But it's just a bunch of different cards that have these buttons and text inside of them. Then we also have the styles for those cards, but we're not going to be touching that at all. It's again just for the background component. So what we need to do is we need to have a style sheet for our Intro.js clone, and we need to have a JavaScript file, which is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. I'm going to link in here another style sheet. So we're just going to say link here, CSS, and this one we're just going to call intro CSS. I'm just going to link it first so it doesn't accidentally inherit any of these other styles that we don't want. And then I'm also going to get my JavaScript file in here. I'm just going to call it script.js. And we'll just defer that script so it loads after everything else. That should be all we need in here done, so we can just save that and create those files. So we'll say styles.css and script.js, and I called this intro.css instead of styles. So we'll say intro, there we go. So the very first thing I probably want to work on is going to be the styling for the actual modal itself and the highlight section, because that's going to be the majority of the content in the CSS. And then from there, we can go to the JavaScript where we move it around. So when we click Live Demo, you can see we kind of get this grayed out background, and then we have this modal. And when we have something highlighted, you can see it's got this white section with like a black border around it. And then the tooltip obviously just points towards that section. So what we need to do is essentially find a way to make the background all like grayed out like a normal modal. But we need to make one section of our content actually poke through. And this is something that's in CSS is a little bit difficult to do because you can't say like, give me a background where it doesn't cover this one spot. So instead, what we really need to do is we need to create an element that's the exact same size as the thing that we want to show through. And we don't want to give it any background, just like make the background transparent. And then we want to essentially give it like a border or a box shadow or something that's going to cover the rest of our screen. So the border or box shadow in this case is going to cover the entirety of our screen. And then the actual text content in the middle, the thing that we're highlighting, is just going to be an empty rectangle essentially. So let me kind of show you what I'm talking about. We're just let's just call it highlight container or something like that. It doesn't really matter what the name is. That's just going to be this white background section that's hovering over what we want. And what we want to do is we want to give it that black border. So we'll say like 1 pixel solid black for now. And we want to also make sure it covers the rest of our screen. And we can't use another border because we're already using border. So a great alternative would be something like box shadow. So we can just do a box shadow that's going to be massive and cover our entire screen. So I'm not super familiar with box shadow, but I think we want our offset to be 0 pixels in all directions. We have spread and we have blur. So I believe blur we want to be 0 because we don't actually want it to blur at all, but we want our spread to be quite large. So we'll just say 100 V max. That should make sure it always covers our entire screen no matter what. And then we need to give it a color. So let's just give it an RGBA 0, 0, 0, and like 0.2. That'll make it so it's partially transparent. And let's just put this on our page to see what we're working with. So what we can do is we can just say highlight, what did I call it? It was highlight container. I'll just copy that over. There we go, highlight container. And so if we give it a specific dimension, so let's just say we give it a width of 200, or let's just say 50 pixels, and we'll do the same thing for height, we should hopefully see something on our page. Come over to here. Of course, we're not seeing anything. Let me make sure that it's applying these styles correctly. What we can do is we can just say our element is not anywhere on our page. That's because we need to make sure we're using live server to run this. So let me just get it running with live server. There we go. And we will close out of the old version. There we go. Okay, so now we have our rectangle showing up, or our square in our case showing up, but everything else is showing up over top of it. We need to make sure we give it a z index that's going to be really large. So we'll just say like, I don't know, 99999. It's still not showing up over everything. Oh, of course, we need to give it a position. In our case, we'll give it a position of absolute. That'll make the z index actually work. And now we can see it's showing up over top of everything. And depending on how dark we want the rest of our screen to be, like 0.5 makes it really dark. We could do like 0.4, maybe 0.3. Let's just do 0.3. I think that looks pretty good. So now we have this essentially container. And if we move this, so let's just say we give it a top of 50 pixels, and we're going to give it a left of 50% just so it will show up on the top of 20. There you go. You can see we're highlighting the word for kind of accidentally, but you can see that this word for looks like it's not having any background covering it. And that's because all this darker color is from that box shadow, and it's all going outward from our box. And then our box just doesn't have any background. So it's like an empty hole in the middle of this, screen of gray essentially. So I think that looks really good. And yeah, it is not covering our entire screen though. Let me see what it looks like over here. If we scroll down, yeah, it's definitely covering everything. Well, up to a certain point at least. So in order to make it cover everything, we can use position fixed for it. I don't really like the idea of doing position fixed though, because then if we scroll, the entire box would move. So instead of doing like 100 Vmax, we could just make this a massively large number. We could do like just a huge number like this, for example. And that means it'll cover our page no matter how big our page is. Yeah, as you can see, no matter how big our page is, this is covering it. I think that's probably what they're doing over here, because when we get to a certain point, scroll down, you can see their styling stops. So they're just using a large number, but theirs isn't quite large enough to cover the full page, which is fine because in most scenarios, you're not going to be scrolling when you're using this tutorial. You're going to be clicking next and it's going to move you to the next place and so on. So that's really what we want to focus on. So I think having this work as is, okay, that's fine. The next step that we need to do is make it look a little better. We want to have these rounded corners and we want this border to be bigger. So we'll do like 5 pixels. And we'll do like a border radius here of 0.5 EM. See if that looks a little better. 5 pixels is definitely too big. We'll just change this to EM. We'll do like 0.2, 0.1 EM. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I think that looks good. Yeah, I don't really think there's anything I would change from that. It looks almost the same. Maybe this is like 0.25 EM for the border radius. Yeah, that looks pretty much identical to what they have over here. So now we have our highlight section done. And the way this highlight container is going to work is we're going to like choose an element. We're going to say, hey, highlight, in our case, this house is for sale. And what this element is going to do is it's going to put the top, left, width, and height automatically in the correct location to highlight that place. And by default, if we have none of these specified, you can see we just have this circle here because it has no content inside of it, because it right now is just a border essentially. So I think that's fine, yeah. Because eventually, if we don't want this to show up, we'll just give it a display of none. So in the case of if we just want to have a modal, actually, we would need to give it a border of none. Yeah, if we want it to not show up, we give it a border of none, because if we go back to the first step here, you can see when they have just a modal showing up and nothing else, you can see that it just still has that background, and that background is coming from our highlight container, but we just make sure that it has no border, because otherwise we're going to get that little dot showing up on our screen, which is just the border of the element. There's our highlight container done. And let's do our highlight container dot hide. We'll just say border none. And that's just going to, if we give it a hide class now, in the case that we don't have one, there we go. You can see that it's only giving us that dark background color, and it's not actually giving us the text inside of it. That is perfect. The next thing we're going to need is our modal. So let's just say dot modal. And let's give our modal a, we're not going to do this like section down here at the bottom for the modal. I don't think it's super important, and it's honestly really hard to work with in the UI because it's so small. We're going to need to give it maybe a title, some text, and then a footer section. So we're going to give it a title. Let's give it some body. And we'll just give it a footer down here. And inside the footer, we'll have some buttons. So our first button is going to say back, and the next one is going to say next. That should be pretty easy. We'll just say data next button, because I know I'm going to be accessing these in the JavaScript, so I might as well just give them data attributes now. Back button, this is going to be our data highlight container. And then here our data modal. There we go. We have our title and our body. And I guess I don't actually need to give these data attributes because we're probably going to create these elements in our JavaScript and not actually leave them in the HTML. Okay, let me think. What else is there that we need to do? don't think there's too much. Let's just add in some content for a modal to see what it would look like. We can just say hi there, make this really similar. Might as well just copy this exact text, paste it in there. And there we go, there's our modal. So if we scroll up, we can see there our modal is. We obviously need to style our modal. So let's come in here, we got a modal. Background color, it's gonna be white. And it's also going to be a position of absolute, I believe. Yeah, I would say so. And then, let's see, we need to style the title. We just do like font size 1.1 EM. We'll do like 1.5 EM. Did I give it a class of title? Title in, oh, duh, space. There we go. So now it's a little bit bigger. Let's change it to like 1.25 EM. We'll do like font weight, bold. There we go. And then our body, we don't really need to do anything with. We got our modal, whoops, footer. We're gonna say border on the top is 1 pixel, solid 777, I think. It doesn't really have to be perfect. Obviously their styling is really basic. We're gonna keep ours pretty basic as well. We're gonna give it a little padding. Let's say we're gonna do like 0.25 EM, the REM. See how that looks. Of course, we probably should give this a border. So say border, 1 pixel, solid 777. There's our border, and we'll give it a border radius of 0.25 EM. There we go. Let me think, what else do we need to do? We should probably give our body and title some padding. So we'll say modal body and modal title padding, and this one's going to be a little bit bigger, so we'll give them like 0.5 EM. We'll do REM here. There we go. I think that looks good enough. We have a lot of spacing on our title, so maybe our title can have like padding bottom 0 and margin bottom 0. Okay, it's not beautiful, but it's good enough for what we're going to do for our use case. And in our footer, let's change this to a display of flex, justify content, space between. There we go, just to space out our buttons. And we're also going to give this a max width. We don't want it to be very big. We'll say like 200 pixels, maybe. What does theirs look like? Yeah, theirs is about that 200-ish pixel size. So that looks pretty good in my opinion. We should probably give it a close button too. So let's see, we'll just say button. We're going to use this at times. That'll give us an X button. And we'll just give it a class of close button. There we go. So we can select the close button inside of our modal. Position it absolutely. Top is 0, right is 0. There we go. And we're going to give it a background, none, border, none. And we'll say font size 1 REM. So it's just normal font size. Cursor is going to be pointer. Let's see what else we need to do to this. I don't think that there's much else we need to do. Maybe on hover, modal, whoops, modal, close button, hover. We're just going to change the color to a darker color. So by default, our color is going to be 777, and we'll change it to black. And we'll also give it a transition so it looks nice. Transition of 150 milliseconds, ease in out. And finally, let's give our modal here. Oh, we already gave it a background color white. We need to fix the Z index. So our Z index for this should be like 9001, and this should be 9000, just so this shows up over top. There we go. That looks good. Hi there, welcome. And we got our back and our next button. I don't really see anything that I would want to change about this. I think our modal looks really good. We could add the arrow to it. For example, here they have the arrow. I've already done tutorials on how to create this style of tooltip with an arrow, so I'm not actually going to cover that in this one because I don't think it's very important. It doesn't really cover much of the actual core to this project, which is all about how do we highlight the right section and make sure we move between all the sections with the really smooth, cool looking animation. That I think is what is the important thing to focus on in this tutorial. So we have our basic modal done, we have the highlight done, we have our tooltip, modal done. All we really have left to do is to hook it all up with the JavaScript, because right now everything's working, but obviously it's not doing anything. Also, I want to increase our spacing a little bit because everything is really cramped. So we'll do like 0.5 rem, and this will be 1 rem. There we go. Our modal looks a little bit better that way. Also, I want to make sure our button's inside of our footer. .modal .footer just buttons. Cursor pointer. There we go. A little bit better. Okay. Now let's move on to the hard part, which is going to be the JavaScript. So the way that I want this API to work is very similar to the way their API works, where essentially you just have some steps, and the steps is an array of objects, and it has the text inside of it. So for our example here, we're going to have like a title, we're going to have a body, and then we're going to potentially have an element if we want to highlight something with an element. So I want to have like a class maybe, we'll just call it intro. And this intro class, I think, is going to take care of all of this. So in the constructor, we're going to pass it in some steps. Yeah, so we can just say this dot steps equals steps. And then we're going to have a start function. And the start function is just going to start at the very beginning of our steps. So we can also say like this dot current step equals 0. And we're going to put that in our start function. That way we can loop through all of our different steps. So like current step index. There we go. Okay. Now let's see what we would do. We would say like new intro, pass it all of our steps. So we'll say like const intro equals intro dot start. There we go. And we pass it in an array. And let's just do a really basic one where all we have is the modal that we want to show up. So we're just going to say like title. That's going to be test title. And in the body, we're just going to say, this is the body of the modal. Okay. I think that's all we really need to have in here for our first introduction to what this is going to be. Now we need to actually get our modal and our other stuff into our JavaScript. So if we come over to here, let me think of the best way to do this. Well, we can just copy this for now. And I think it's small enough, we might just create it all in JavaScript. So let's see here. Our modal is really basic. We don't need these data attributes. We can get rid of that data attribute there, get rid of this one. There we go. So all we essentially have is a modal with the class modal, this div here, we have a button, and we have 3 more divs and then 2 more buttons. So yeah, I think we can just create that in plain JavaScript. I'm going to create just like a private method called create modal. Okay. And what we'll do is we'll try to first get our modal. So we'll say if this modal equals null. So if it's not equal to null, we will return. So if we already have a modal, we just want to return that modal. So we'll return, actually, we're not even going to save the modal, I don't think. What's the best way to do this? Let's just create our modal first, I guess. So we'll say const modal equals document.create element. It's going to be a div, and we'll say modal.classlist.add modal. There we go. So that's that part taken care of. Next, we're going to have our close button. So we'll say const close button equals create element, a button, and this close button, whoops, dot inner text is going to be equal to this. We want to make this inner HTML, I believe, in order for it to actually format itself properly. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure. And we're going to have our close button dot class list. We're going to add that close button class into it. And we can say modal dot append close button. There we go. And let's just return our modal down here. So all we have right now is the close button, and that's it. But that's good enough to get started. So in our start, we can say create modal. Okay. I guess you probably would want to create, no, we don't want to create the modal till we start. And then what I want to do is I want to show the first step. I think, yeah. So what we can do is we can say, we're going to have like a show method. And the show method, we'll just call it show current step. Okay, show current step. What we want to do is we want to, trying to think here. We want to show the modal first. So what we can do is we can say, we need essentially some access to our modal. And then we want to change the title and we want to change the text of it. Trying to think of the best way to do this. Maybe we create a separate class for our modal. And we can have a constructor here. And inside the constructor, we can do essentially everything that's in this function. So we're just going to copy this over. We're going to say this dot modal equals this dot create modal. So we're creating a modal, and then we can say like set title. Going to take in a value for our title, and all I want to do is I want to use the modal, and I want to use the title portion of it. Let me think. So we can, for when we create a modal, we can return the modal, title, the next button. We just need all the elements essentially. So I think I'm going to change this around. So we're going to create our modal up here, copy this up, change it like this. We're adding that class list. I'm going to do the same thing here with our close button, but I'm going to make it a local reference. So we got our close button. Okay. And then we're going to need a title section. So our title looks like just a div with the class title. So we can essentially do this exact code, but change this to title. There we go. And when we set our title, we can say this dot title dot inner text equals value. Okay. There we go. And we can do the same thing for our body. And up here, we essentially want to copy. And this will say body. I think that's what we called it. Yeah, body. And I just want to make sure I append these to our modal. So it's this dot modal. And we're appending our body and our title. And we finally can just might as well append our footer as well. So we can say const footer equals document.create element. Just create a div for now. We could do more semantic HTMLs by like making this a footer here. This would be a header. That would help a little bit. And then we can say footer, actually, oh, I think our footer has a class of footer on it. Let's make sure. Yeah, footer. So footer.classlist, add footer. And then we need to create some buttons. So I'm just going to copy this. And we can say this is going to be our back button. We're going to append that to our footer. And I want the text in here to say back. And I'm just going to use text content here instead. And I don't think it has a class list. Let me make sure. Nope, no class list on our back button. I'm just going to copy the back button down here. This is going to be for our next button. There we go. And the text should say next. And then we want to put our footer in our modal. So we'll say this dot modal dot, whoops, modal dot append footer. And we just come up here, we can say modal, close button, title, body, back button, and we have our next button. Some of these I don't even know if we need references to, like our modal, maybe not, and same with our close button, but for now we'll just keep them as references. We don't need this create modal function. And now what we can do is we can say like this dot modal equals new modal. Okay. Might as well make that private so it can't be changed. And so what we can do is we can call like a show method on it. We need to give it a show method. And we don't need to create a modal until we start, I don't think. Yeah, we don't really need the modal to be there until we actually call the start method. So yeah, we can say this is our modal. Showing the current step, we're just going to make sure our modal is shown. Honestly, I don't think we actually need to do that though, because by default, our modal should be visible. So what we can do is we can just come in here and say, actually, no. Yeah, we should make it visible. So we can say modal, whoops, modal.show. So we're going to have a show function. And this show function, all it needs to do is just say this.modal.classlist.add show. So we can create a simple show class for our modal. Modal.show. And all I'm going to do is change our opacity to 1, I believe. And we'll make our scale 1 as well. And here by default, whoops, this should be transform scale of 1. And then by default, we want the opacity and the scale to be 0. And then we can just animate those by using a transition. So we'll say transition, 150 milliseconds, ease in and out. Okay. So the show hopefully like pop in and out as we give it the show class. So if we just come in here and we give it the class of show, and we like remove that. I mean, since it's refreshing the page, it's obviously not working like we expect, but it'll like fade in and out, hopefully. That is what I'm expecting with this show class. Okay, back to our script. So we're showing our modal, and then what we need to do is give it a title and a body. So we can say this dot modal dot modal. Need to make that a private variable up here. Dot title equals, let's get like a current step getter. Get current step, we might as well make it private. Return this dot steps of this dot current step index. Okay. So we can just say this dot current step dot title. We can do the same exact thing for our body. So we're just getting the property for the title and the body that we passed into our current step, and we're setting that for our modal. That looks good, and that will show our current step. Yeah, that looks really good. Okay. So when we call start, what we want to do is we want to show our current step. We don't need this create modal nonsense anymore. So now, hopefully, it should show our modal with all of this code. So let's inspect our page to see what's going on, because I'm guessing there's an error somewhere. No errors in our console. I wonder if everything's being run as we expect it to be. So let's just put a simple console log in somewhere, because we are calling start. So let's just do a console log right here. Console.log here, just to see if this code is being run. You know what? It would actually help a lot if I removed this. We don't need this anymore. And I commented that out. There we go. Okay, let's make sure that worked. We'll inspect. Go over to our console. It is printing out here. So it is going through our code. It is calling the show method on our modal. So we should have a modal. Oh, you know what? We need to add our modal to the page. So here we can just say document.body.append this.modal. Okay. That should add the modal to our page. Let's see if it actually did. We come in here. We do have our modal down here, and it does have show class being applied to it. Oh, you know what? The problem is that our modal doesn't have a position, because I don't think it's positioned absolute. It is position absolute, but we're not giving it a position. So we need to give it a position, and it should be in the middle of our screen. Let me think here, the best way to do that. Because like over here, you can see it's in the middle of the screen. Let me go back up, live demo. And when I scroll, it stays in that position. I think it should probably scroll with us. So, because it just, yeah, it would make more sense if it scrolled with us. So what I want to do is I'm going to make it positioned in the center of our screen with a fixed position. So we'll say, what do we want to do? So if this dot current step dot element equals null. So if the element is null, we want to do something different. Otherwise, we'll do what the element's null. So if it's null, we want to take our modal, and what we want to do is we want to make it a fixed modal. So we'll say we're going to call position function on it, and we're going to give it an x value, a y value, and then we're going to say whether or not we want it to be fixed. In our case, we're going to say true to be fixed. So let me think. We essentially just want to center it. So we can just say like center. There we go. We'll just give it a function called center. And this center function, all it's going to do is just going to add a class list for center, because we can do all the centering in our CSS. what we can do is we can say, hey, if we have a modal.center, I want to change our position to be fixed. Our top is 50%, our left is 50%, and our transform, we're going to call this our translate, is going to be translate -50%, -50%. And we can use that variable up here. Translate. And we're also going to use a scale variable. So we're going to say scale 1. And this will be set to var scale. And the reason I'm using variables here so I don't have to worry about redefining this transform all over the place. I just have to define it once, and then these variables can change. It makes it a lot easier to work with. So now let's see. It is positioned not quite in the center of our screen. So this should say scale, translate, change that. There we go, dead center in our screen. That looks really good. That's exactly what I wanted. Okay, so we have our modal being done, and it's always dead center in our screen when it doesn't have an element. If it does have an element, we want to do something else. And we also want to make these next and back buttons work. So by default, our back button should be disabled, and then we want to re-enable it when they're on the next step. So if we're on the current step, we want our back button to be disabled. Let's just minimize this constructor for now. I'm kind of not liking the fact that I put this in 2 separate classes, but I don't know of a good way to combine them together without having something kind of overwhelming. So we got our modal. Maybe in the show method. Let me think. We could position it as well. Because we first want to disable our back button. So we'll just say this dot modal dot back button enabled. We'll call it enable back button. And we're either going to pass true or false. And this is just going to be this dot current step index equals 0. Not equal to 0. Because if we're not on the first step, enable it. Okay. So we'll say enable back button enabled. And we can say this dot back button dot disabled equals not enabled. There you go. Now it is disabled. And if we're on a different step that's not the first step, then it should be enabled. Okay. Also, when we show our current step, I want to show this background element. So I'm going to copy this back over to here just so we can work with it. Comment that out. So let's think here. We don't need this data attribute anymore. So it's just a highlight container class. That's it. So we're going to have our modal, and the modal will have that highlight container. This is a little bit more complicated than I thought, especially with all these class stuff that I'm doing. Should be fine though. So when we create our modal, maybe we want to create our highlight container in the same spot. Or maybe the highlight container can live inside of here. So we'll say this dot highlight container equals document dot create element div. We'll just put this in its own function. Create highlight container. There we go. So we can just say highlight container equals that. Highlight container dot class list dot add. We want to add that highlight container class. Oops. Highlight container. There we go. And then we can return our highlight container. But first, we want to add it to our page. So document dot body dot append highlight container. Okay. Perfect. So now up here, we can just say this dot highlight container equals create highlight container. I spelled this wrong. There we go. So we've got our modal and our highlight container, and down here we can say If it is an element, then we're going to say this dot highlight container. We want to add the class list for hide up here. So we'll say class list dot add hide. There we go. That gives us that nice background. And if we didn't hide it, you're going to see, we're going to get that black dot somewhere, wherever, be down here, I think. Yeah, at the very bottom, it's really hard to see. There's a black dot, essentially. So let's put that back so it's hidden. And there we go. We have our container, and it looks really good. None of these buttons do anything yet. That's fine. Next step, what we need to do is make it so the next and back button works. So let's create another thing. So we'll say like test title 2, body 2. That'll be our second step. And we want to make our next and our back button work. So when we create a new modal, we're going to say like on next and on back. We want to pass both of these properties in. So what we can do is we can just come up here, on next, on back. And we can say this dot back button dot add event listener for clicking, and we'll say on back. Do the exact same thing for our next button. This is going to say on next. And then down here where we create our modal, we can just say this dot current step minus minus for our first one, and this dot current step plus plus. And just simplify this a little bit. There we go. So if we click on the back button, it subtracts one, and if we click on the plus button, it adds one to our current step. We also want to show the next step, I guess. We can just come in here. We could say this dot show current step. Probably clean this up a little bit by using getters, but that's fine. Okay, so when we click next, it should show the next step. It didn't look like it changed anything. Our titles are the same and everything. Let's make sure that we had no errors. Over to our console. Undefined reading title cannot read properties undefined. That is for our current step. So it's having trouble getting our current step. So this is returning null. Current step index, this dot steps. Should be getting this. Let's just do some console logging to figure out what's going on. So in our show current step, I just want to console.log our steps and this dot current step index. Let's see what this returns. So we have an array with 2 elements, and the first time we get is 0. We hit plus, we're getting -1. Okay, first of all, I have my back and next flipped. This should say on back, on next. That'll fix that problem. There we go. We went to the second one here. Now when I click next, I'm going to get an error because our next button should be like a done button. So here we're going to say if this dot current step index is greater than this dot steps dot length. I believe that would be it. Yeah, like that. Then we want to like hide the modal, I think. Yeah, we want to hide everything essentially. That means just like, we'll just call the finish method. We're going to create a method called finish. Yeah, otherwise we're going to show the next step. Okay, so let's create a finish method. We'll do it right underneath a start. Finish, all it's going to do is this dot modal dot remove, this dot highlight container dot remove, and that should clean everything up. So I click next again, and it should remove everything, but it did not. Let's inspect to see what's going on. Go over to our console. This dot modal dot remove is not a function. Oh, it's duh. I didn't have a remove function up here. Remove is just going to say this dot modal dot remove. There we go. That deleted it. That looks really good. We refresh, bring it back. Okay. Now the next step is what happens if we want to highlight an element. So we're going to have an element, and it's just going to say document.querySelector. We're going to use a data attribute. We'll just say like data first. And we're just going to put that on a random element that we want to highlight. So for our example, let's highlight, let's just do the title. Sure. Data first. Come down into here. So now if we have an element, this right here is going to run our code right here for what we do if we have an element. So I want to take our modal, I want to position it somewhere for now. We're just going to comment that out, but we're going to do some kind of positioning with like an X, a Y, and like an element or something like that. Our highlight container, we don't want to add the class height to it, but we do want to position it in the correct location. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our element. So we're going to say this dot current step dot element dot get client bounding rect. I believe that is the function. So we're going to say like const rect is equal to. Let's just log this out for now, just to make sure this is the right function before I go ahead. But it should have like top left properties. So when I click next, get client rounding rect. Let's just Google it. Get bounding client rect. I always mess up the order. Okay, so get bounding client rect. So now when we hit the next button, there we go. We're getting this rectangle, and this rectangle, most importantly, has an X and a Y position, and it also has a height and a width, as well as like a top and a left. So we can use the top and the left position and the width and the height to determine exactly how large we want our, enclosing container to be. So what we can do is we can say this dot highlight container dot style dot, what do we want it to be? Our top is going to be equal to rect dot top, and it's going to be in pixels. And we want to do this for our left, our width, and our height, I believe. Whoops, cancel out of that. There we go. So now hopefully when we click next, there you go. You can see that this highlight section has perfectly highlighted that area. I don't know why our border is not showing up. Let me look at our CSS real quick. Oh, it's because the hide class is still there. We want to remove the hide class. So we're going to come in here, class list dot remove hide. And we'll click next. There we go. That's perfectly highlighting that section. Now, obviously, we want to go about and add in some animations for this. And I believe we can really easily do that by just saying transition on, and we just want the transition to be, let's say like 250 milliseconds. Ease in, out. There we go. Let's see what that looks like. So back. Oh, and by default, here what we want to do is we want to take our highlight container. Let's just turn this into a function. We'll call it like position highlight container. I don't really like a lot of these names, but it's about as good as we can do. So we're going to come in here. This is going to take in a rect, I guess, that's going to have a top, left, width, and height. Yeah, that should be fine. Okay, so we're going to call this dot position with our rect. And we're also going to call that up here, but I want to pass it in our own. So we're going to say x0, y0, width 0, height 0. There we go. So now it doesn't show up. Hit next. You can see it kind of expands inwards. Hit back. You can see it disappears. That looks pretty good, I think. It's pretty similar to what they have here, I believe. Yeah, it looks like theirs is like expanding from the center, but I think it should be good enough. Yeah, so let's refresh that again. So we hit next, boom, it shows up, back, it disappears. Yeah, and by default, maybe we want to position this in the dead center of our screen. I don't know, it doesn't really matter though. I think this is fine, as is, okay. Yeah, width and height. I don't really like the animation of width and height very much, so maybe we'll change the scale. Yeah, we'll change the scale instead of the width and height. No, I think this is fine. This is fine. Okay. And now we just need to get our modal in the correct position. So our modal is going to use the same rect that we're going to use for our highlighting position. And the way we want to position this is we want it to be, like over here, they just put the modal in like the top left or the bottom left, depending on like, whoops, let's go back to that example. So like here you can see it's in the bottom left. Here you can see it's on the top left. Either way, it's always in that top top-ish corner. I think that's fine for our use case, or we can put it in the center. It doesn't really matter too much. So when we position our modal, we're going to give it an X and a Y position, which is going to be, actually, let's just give it a rect. Honestly, that's probably what we want to do. We're going to give it a rect for where we want to position it. And let's use that function up here. Okay. There we go. Whoops. And inside of our CSS, let's see here. We want this center to always override whatever we have for our modal up here. So up here, we're going to give it like an X, a property, I think. Yeah, we'll give it an X. Well, like everything is going to be based on it. So we'll say like top is our Y variable. And then we're going to give it an X variable, which is our left. Yeah, that's all we need to do. So then down here, change this to Y and X. There we go. Okay. So back in here, I first want to make sure we remove that center class. So we'll just pass it in false. And say like is centered. We'll just say value. By default, it's going to be true. Change this to toggle. And we'll pass in the value. And I'll do the same exact thing for show. This should just allow us to pass in like true or false into it. So now we can say center, where's that? False, and it will no longer be centered, which is good. And we can position it. Actually, sorry. Go back down to where we were. Center here should be true, center here should be false. Okay. And now we can position that at that rectangle. So up here, we're going to pass in a rect. And this rect is going to have a top, a left. Those are really the values we care about. Yeah. So then we can say this dot modal dot style dot set property. We want to set our X property to left. We're going to convert this to pixels. We're going to have to do some offsetting. That's fine. Same thing with our Y. This is going to be our top. Let's just see how this looks for now. Hit next. You can see it showing up at that top left corner. So if we want it to be on the top, okay, let me think. So if we want it to be a top positioned element, or if we want to position it above it, we need to base this on the bottom left. Let me think. Yeah, so we would want our X to be essentially 100% of our height of like this thing's height. I'm trying to think. So we're going to give it a top, a left, and we want to determine whether we want it to be above or below. Let me think. I guess the first thing we can do is just, we're going to put it below. So to put it below, we can say that this is actually going to be left. That's fine. And this is going to be bottom. And let's just create an offset variable. We'll say like, we'll do it in EMs. So we can just say here, we'll say like calc that many pixels plus our offset. And that's going to be, yeah, just like that. So our offset here, we'll say it's like 0.5, we'll say 1 rem. Okay, let's copy this down to here, change this to bottom, see if that looks a little better. Something's broken, of course. Let's inspect, go to our console. Bottom is not defined. Oh, duh. There we go. Okay, now it is positioned in that correct location. Maybe 0.5 is better here. There we go. I don't really like how it's moving. What I want to do is I want to like remove the class for showing, and then I want to re-add it. Because when we go to the next step, I want to like hide our modal and then re-show it after our animation finishes. It's a little bit of a pain, but this is fine. This is fine for now. So there we go. And then next obviously finishes it, refresh, go next, go back. Okay, the position is wrong. When we center it, our position should override it. I guess we need to set this to like important. That's kind of a pain. I need to override these values. back. Okay, back to the center. Perfect. Yeah, our modal is just sliding around wherever we need it to go. That looks good. So next, back, next, back. And I don't know why it's sliding when we change our Y. I guess we should give these like a default value. No. Let me inspect this real quick. We'll go to our modal. Right now it has a Y and an X value that are set on it. Let's refresh though, because by default, there are no Y and X values set, but it should have a Y and X value here that are set. I guess we could just default these to 50%. That'll fix the issue. Now it slides. Okay, there we go. That works. Good enough for our use case. So now we have our back and our next button. It's highlighting that. Let's see what would happen if we wanted to highlight something off the screen. So let's just go down to one of these cards that's way down here. We'll say like data second. Okay. And then scroll, oops, not in there, in our script. Scroll way down here. We'll just copy this. We'll say this is title 3, body 3, and this will say second. So we go to here, that works, and we click next. Now we need to scroll the element into view. So there's actually a really handy function we can use for that, which is called exactly that. This dot current step dot element dot scroll into view. Let's see if this works. There we go. It scrolled this thing into view. I want it to be centered. So let me think here. I don't remember the syntax. MDN scroll into view. So, okay, it takes an object. Behavior, we want it to be smooth, so just gonna look a little better. And then block and inline should be centered. Okay, let's see if that looks a little better. So scroll up here, click next. There we go, it scrolled up to that section. I don't know why our element is not in the right position. Clearly we did something wrong. Let's see. Console, no errors. Where is the element? Let's just check our elements tab here. This is, where's our modal at? Here's our modal. It has a position of 8 pixels plus 0.5 EM and a Y of negative 1,000 pixels. That seems a little off. I don't even see where it is on the page. Same thing with our highlight container. The top value is really weird. Like negative 1,000 pixels. Maybe it's because our rect, get bounding client rect. Let me just look this up. Let me see how these dimensions are calculated. So top left and XY, they should be based on, they're based on the viewport. We don't really want it to be based on the viewport. We want it to be based on this boundary vector top left corner of the document. Just add the current scrolling position to the top left. Okay, so we need to get the scroll X and the scroll Y and add them onto the end. So plus window dot scroll X. And this should be Y. That should hopefully fix that issue. So let's just randomly scroll, click next. There we go, it moved to the right spot. We need to make sure we also do this on our modal. So we'll come up here, bottom, plus that, make sure this one is X. Okay, click next. It did move to the right location, but we didn't scroll for some reason. There we did. We did scroll on that one though. And our highlight is good. I do want to give our highlight a little bit of padding though. So what we're going to do is we're going to come into here for our highlight container. We'll just say like padding 1 rem, or maybe like 0.5. Just give it a little bit of space. Yeah, and then we can say transform, translate, negative 0.25 rem and negative 0.25 rem. That should center it, yeah. I think so. Let's just change this to 1 REM. And this is 0.5, 0.5. Let me just refresh. So next. Okay, that highlighted that section. It looks really large. So maybe this padding is too big. Oh, we need to do 0.5. Yeah, there we go. Okay. That looks good. We want to make sure overflow doesn't matter. So we'll change our body overflow hidden. There we go. And we also probably want to give this a max width of 100 VW minus 1 REM. That way it's never too big. Or maybe we'll do it minus 2 REM so we have some margins. I will say margin is 0.5 REM. And then we would need to translate by 1 REM in both directions. There we go. I think, no, that didn't quite do what I wanted. I mean, 7.5? That looks a little bit more maybe centered. The Y is definitely not centered. The X is centered. Now that, yeah, the X is not centered here. I think it's this max width that's throwing me off. We'll get rid of the margins. We'll change this back to 0.5. That's centered, yeah, okay. And this one just overflows, which is kind of a pain. I really don't want the overflow. That's what I'm trying to stop, I think. So if I come in here and I say my max width is 100 VW, and my max, I guess I don't like that overflow. Calculate that minus 1 REM. That should have fixed the problem. 2 REM. That does fix it. I wonder if we can center. How do we center this the best? I'm trying to think. So essentially, I want to make sure that it's centered if the max width is taken into account here. What if I did like margin? No, that wouldn't work because we can't auto margin it. Maybe we could. Margin 0 auto. Or maybe it's auto 0. I don't remember the order. No, that didn't work. I didn't think it would. Oh, gosh. I like the idea of this padding, but I'm not sure the best way to solve it without having this overflow issue like you're seeing here, because they don't have the overflow issue. As you can see, they have it fitting, and maybe they just don't have any padding. I mean, it looks like they really don't have any padding. Go back to the live demo. Next couple times, next again. Yeah, it really doesn't look like they're using any padding, or if they are, it's very minimal. So maybe we just need to decrease our padding to like 0.25. Make it a little small. There we go. We just have a very small amount of padding around it. I think that looks pretty good. And as you can see, this is showing up in the bottom right-hand corner. I can't scroll my page, I just realized. That's one thing that's a problem. Oh, it's because overflow X should be hidden. We don't even need this anymore, so we can get rid of that. There we go. Now I can scroll again. Good. Click back, bring me back to that. So it looks like all the highlight and everything is working. That's really good. I like that. Yeah, it looks really good. Now I think we just need to make it so our tooltip always shows up in the right location and maybe give it a little bit more space. So go up to our tooltip for our modal. Our offset should be a little bit larger on the Y direction. So we'll say like plus, we'll just say plus 0.5 REM. That just takes into account that padding we added. There we go. Maybe make it 2.5. There we go. That looks good. That looks good. Okay, so now we have that. Again, like I said, the only thing we really need to focus on is going to be... What was it? The next thing? I'm trying to think. We need to make our buttons work, obviously. Let me just refresh this real quick. Yeah, let's make our close buttons work. So we can just come up here This will be like on close. And we can just copy what we did for our other buttons. Where is that at? Add event listener. We can just add that to our close button. We'll say on close. Make sure that's our close button. So down here, when we create our modal, we can pass it in on close, which just calls this dot finish. There we go. And then if we click on our highlight container on the outside of it, we also probably want to close it. Maybe we click out here. I'm trying to think of the best way to do that. Because if we add a click event to our highlight section, it'd have to be outside the bounds of this element. Let's add event listener to our highlight section. Yeah, we'll do that first. So when we create it, where's that? Here, we'll say highlight container dot add event listener on click. And then what we can do is we can check to see. I wonder if it triggers on the box shadow itself, though. I don't think it would. Let's just see. We'll just do an inspect console. Yeah, it doesn't actually trigger. Okay, that's actually perfect. So what we can just change this to a document. Add event listener, click, and we don't even need this to be there. So what we can do is we can come up here. Wherever we click start. So we can say document add event listener on click. And what we want to do, which we're just going to call this, we're going to say, because we want it to finish, but only if, we'll say body click. This dot body click. And up here we'll define that. This dot body, might as well make it private, equals, can take in an event. So we can do, there we go. And we can say if e dot target dot matches this dot, not matches, we don't want it to be matches. So if the target is the same element, I wonder if we can just do like equals for that. This dot highlight container. Or e dot target dot, because I just want to see, I guess we don't even need that. Okay, so if the target, we'll do it this way. If the target matches highlight container, or the closest highlight container is not equal to null, then we want to call the finish function. Actually, we don't want to call the finish function. So we'll just do return here. That inside of, there you go. So essentially what we're saying is, hey, if we clicked the highlight container or anywhere inside the highlight container, don't do anything. Otherwise, we're going to call finish. So in the finish function, I want to remove this event listener. That way we don't have it hooked up still. So refresh, bunch of errors. Let's see what they are. Go to our console. Private field, oh yeah, duh. Okay, up here we define this variable. We just need to define it out there. There we go. Next. That caused an error. Oh, it's because we're clicking in the modal. Ah, okay. Or if the target is modal, or if it matches modal. So dot modal, dot modal. There we go. So now if we click in the modal, nothing happens. Click next. That's good. Click inside here, and it closes. This should be dot highlight container. There we go. Okay, next. Click in here. Perfect. That's exactly what we want. Click next. Moves down here. Click inside of here. Everything's working fine. Click next. There we go. One issue I noticed, though, is let's just go to that last one. I should be able to click these buttons, but I can't. And one easy way to get around this is just set pointer events to none. Now it won't work with clicks and stuff. So now I can click these buttons through here, which is good. But unfortunately, by doing that, it means that it closes because it's not actually picking up our click event listeners. I wonder what it does in here. It lets me click in here and lets me highlight. Interesting. But the way I have it set up, I wonder, because if I click, I had to check to see if it's in the bounds of this current element instead. Man, that's kind of annoying. So I can't just say if the target is this anymore, because now the target is going to be this element. So I guess if I say if the target is the current element, so if the target, I guess, let me see, mdn check if clicked element is certain element. Let's see how this matches works. Only takes in a string. That's unfortunate. Closest. Because I can't, I think I could do like, if the target is equal to this dot current step dot element, or it would have to be inside of that. mdn check if clicked element is inside other element. Let's see, check if element is inside other element, contains. There we go. That's what we're looking for. So, or if the target, or if the current step dot element dot contains e dot target. That should be what we're looking for. And I only want to call this if we have a current step element. So there we go. Let's try this. Next, click in here. Lets me do everything, click outside. It's not closing when I click outside. Probably have some errors going on based on how everything's working. Console, current step element container is not a function. Well, this should be contains. Click out here, it closes, good. Click next, click in here, it doesn't close. Click outside, it closes. Okay, I think it's working. Go down here, we should still be able to interact with these buttons, but as soon as I click outside, it closes. I like that. Yeah, I like that a lot. That looks really good. And it pretty much works exactly the same as what they have over here. Yeah, I like that. Now let me think if there's anything else that we're missing. This looks good because we click next, it closes. Let me look at their example just to make sure there's nothing we're missing. So next, that works, that works, that works. Yeah, I don't think so. All the scrolling is fine. The only thing that is slightly different is we could have our tooltip on the top or the bottom, depending on scroll space. So if we selected like the last element down here, it would be broken. Let's see here. So if I change my data second to be the last element, and go down here, my tooltip, I guess it's just making room for the tooltip on the screen. That's kind of interesting. I didn't think it would do that. That's actually really weird. Because normally absolutely positioned elements just don't show up. They just go off the edge of the page. So I guess that's fine then. We don't really have to worry about making sure it's on the top or the bottom because it's just letting us scroll down and view that. We should probably just add a margin on our thing, maybe. So we could say like margin of 0.5 rem. That didn't actually do anything. Maybe we don't have to worry about that. Yeah, I think this is fine. We could make it so that the tooltip shows on the top or the bottom dynamically, but again, that's something that's a little bit annoying to do. It's just a bunch of math. It's not very interesting to watch, and I've covered things like that in the past on different tutorials, which I'll link to if you want to check out. But I think this code that we have right here pretty much covers all the use cases for this tooltip style thing. The only thing I would change is I would probably rewrite some of this code because the way I have it split up between these two classes with all the private variables is kind of a huge pain. The one nice thing is the actual syntax for using it is really straightforward. We can just say, hey, intro, start, finish, and so on. And I can even like set a timeout here. And what inside of here, I could just call intro.finish. And let's say that this is like 2 seconds later. So now what's going to happen is after 2 seconds, it's just going to automatically close itself, which is really nice. I think that's a really cool feature right there to have that. So overall, I think this is really good. I would probably just clean up this code a little bit because having all these private variables, especially this whole modal class, I'm not a huge fan of. I'd probably just move it into this intro to make it a little bit easier. But yeah, other than that, I really like how this code turned out. If you enjoyed this video, I have another one just like this where I try to create a multi-step form from scratch. It's linked over here, and also the CSS cards you saw in this video, the tutorial for those is going to be linked over here. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.